Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is The Corner with E-Dub. It's your faithful host and server, giving us, you and I both, some lovely nutrition, spiritual nutrition that is, that will help us strengthen and nourish our walk with God. Glory be to Him. Today we're going to be doing primarily Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 6, 1 Peter 5, Proverbs 11, and there are supplemental chapters within 2 Samuel 6, which is the chapter before that, 2 Samuel 5, and 1 Chronicles 13. So that's what I have on deck for you guys today. If you're loving content, feel free to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you know when the next video drops. Also share the content so more people can be blessed by these words of God. If you want to say hi to me, feel free to comment. I'll definitely reply back. As you know, for the long-time listeners, I read from the Common English Version of the Bible, which you can find in the U Version app, which is found in the App Store and Google Play, depending on the device that you have. So that said, let's get into it. I'm going to start from 2 Samuel chapter 5. Give you a few seconds to find it in your Bible, 2 Samuel 5. I'm going to start from these foundational chapters first, so I don't have to, keep going back and forth. It's going to be in one swift motion in order. So 2 Samuel 5. All the Israelite tribes came to David at Hebron and said, "Listen, we are your own flesh. We are your very own flesh and bone. In the past, when Saul ruled over us, you were the one who led Israel out to war and back. What's more, the Lord told you, you will shepherd my people, Israel, and you will be Israel's leader." So all the Israelite elders came to the king at Hebron. King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 40 years. He ruled over Judah for 7.5 years at Hebron. He ruled 33 years over all Israel and Judah and Jerusalem. The king and the troops marched on Jerusalem against the Jebusites, who inhabited their territory. The Jebusites said to David, "You'll never get us in here. Even the blind and the lame will beat you back. David will never enter here," they said to each other. But David did capture the fortress of Zion, which became David's city. On that day, David said, "Whoever attacks the Jebusites should strike the windpipe, because David hates the lame and the blind." That is why people say the blind and the lame will not enter the temple. David occupied the fortress so that it was renamed David's city. David built a city around it from the earthen terraces inward. David grew increasingly powerful, and the Lord of heavenly forces was with him. Tyre's King Hiram sent messengers to David with cedar logs, bricklayers, and carpenters to build David a palace. And David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that his kingship was held in great honor for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David married more secondary wives in Jerusalem and fathered more sons and daughters. The names of his children in Jerusalem were as follows: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ipar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Elida, and Eliphelet. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they all marched up to find him. But David heard of it and went down to the fortress. The Philistines arrived and spread out over the Rephaim valley. David asked the Lord, "Should I attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me?" "Attack them," said the Lord. Or attack them, the Lord replied, "because I will definitely hand the Philistines over to you." So David arrived at Baal Perazim and defeated the Philistines there. He said, "The Lord has burst out against my enemies the way water burst out. This is why that place is called Baal Perazim." And that's referenced again in 2 Samuel 6, verse 8 specifically, which we'll be reading next. The Philistines left their divine images behind, and David and his men carried them off. Once again, the Philistines came up and spread out against the Rephaim valley. When David asked the Lord, God replied, "Don't attack them directly. So go around behind them and come at them from in the front of the balsam trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the trees, then attack, for God has attacked in front of you to defeat the Philistine army." David followed God's orders exactly, and they defeated the Philistine army from Gibeon all the way to Gezer. 2 Samuel 5. Let's go to this main chapter, which is the next one, 2 Samuel chapter 6. Once again, David assembled the select warriors of Israel, 30,000 strong. David and all the troops who were with him set out for Baalah, which is Kiriath Jearim of Judah. We're getting all these pronunciation wrong. Forgive me, please. This whole chapter is actually referenced in 1 Chronicles 13, verses 6 through 10. Specifically, we'll be reading that next. David and all the troops who were with him set out from Baalah, which is Kiriath Jearim of Judah, to bring God's chest up from there, the chest that is called by the name of the Lord of heavenly forces, who sits enthroned on the winged creatures. They loaded God's chest on a new cart and carried it from Abinadab's house, which was on the hill. Uzzah, Ahio, Abinadab's sons, were driving the new cart. Uzzah was beside God's chest while Ahio was walking in front of it. Meanwhile, David and the entire house of Israel celebrating the Lord's presence with all their strength, with their songs, cithers, harps, tambourines, rattles, and cymbals. When they approached Nacon's threshing floor, Uzzah reached out to God's chest and grabbed it because the oxen had stumbled. The Lord became angry at Uzzah, and God struck him there because of his mistake. And he died there next to God's chest. Then David got angry because the Lord's anger lashed out out against Uzzah. So that place is called Perez Uzzah today. That part is actually referenced in the last chapter, 2 Samuel 5, verse 20. David was frightened by the Lord that day. "How will I ever bring the Lord's chest to me?" he asked. So David didn't take the chest away with him to David's city. Instead, he had it put in the house of Obed-Edom, who was from Gath. The Lord's chest stayed with Obed-Edom's household in Gath for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom's household and all that he had. Then King David was told that the Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's family and everything he has because of God's chest being there. So David went and brought God's chest up from Obed-Edom's house to David's city with celebration. When those bearing the chest ran six steps, David sacrificed an ox and a fatling calf. David, dressed in a linen priestly vest, danced with all his strength before the Lord. This is how David and the entire house of Israel brought up the Lord's chest with shouts and trumpet blasts. As the Lord's chest entered David's city, Saul's daughter, Michal, was watching from a window. She saw King David jumping and dancing before the Lord, and she lost all respect for him. The Lord's chests were brought in and put in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered entirely burnt offerings in the Lord's presence in addition to well-being sacrifices. When David finished offering the entirely burnt offerings and the well-being sacrifices, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heavenly forces. He distributed food among all the people of Israel to the whole crowd, male and female, each receiving a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. And all the people went back to their homes. David went home to bless his household, but Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet him. How did Israel's king honor himself today? She asked. By exposing herself in plain view of the female servants of his subjects like any decent person would. David replied to Michal, I was celebrating before the Lord, who chose me over your father and who chose me over your father and his entire family, who appointed me leader of the Lord's people, over Israel, and I will celebrate before the Lord again. I may humiliate myself even more, and I may be humbled in my own eyes, but I will be honored by the female servants you are talking about. Michal, Saul's daughter, had no children to the day she died. That's 2 Samuel 6. And before we ran out of time for part one for your Wednesday, June 8th, 2022, we're going to go to 1 Chronicles chapter 13. 1 Chronicles 13. Okay. After consulting with the captains of the units of 1,800, in fact, with every leader, David said to the entire Israelite assembly, if you approve and if the Lord our God agrees, let's spread the word to the rest of our relatives in all regions of Israel, including the priests and the Levites in their cities with pasture lands. Let's ask them to join us, so that we may bring the chest of our God back to us, for we didn't look for it in Saul's days. The whole assembly agreed to do so, because all the people thought it was the right thing to do. So David assembled all Israel from the border of Egypt, which was referenced in 1 Kings chapter 8 and 2 Chronicles 7. So we're going to be in Joshua 15. So I guess we gotta go back to those in part 2 of today. So David assembled all of Israel from the border of Egypt to Lebo Hamath in order to bring up God's chest from Kiriath Jearim. Then David and all Israel went up towards Bala to Kiriath Jearim, which belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the chest of God, the Lord, who sits enthroned on the winged creatures, where he is called by name. They moved God's chest onto a new car from Abinadab's house. Uzzah and Ahiah were guiding the car while David and all Israel celebrated in God's presence with all their strength, accompanied by songs, cithers, harps, tambourines, cymbals, and trumpets. When they came to Chidon's threshing floor, Uzzah reached out to the chest and grabbed it because the oxen had stumbled. But the Lord became angry with Uzzah and struck him because he had placed his hand on the chest. He died right there before God. David was angry that the Lord lashed out at Uzzah, so that place is still called Perez Uzzah today. David was frightened by God that day. How will I ever bring God's chest home to me? Yes. So David didn't take the chest away with him to David's city. Instead, he had it put in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. God's chest stayed with Obed-Edom's household for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom's household and all that he had. 1 Chronicles 13. Definitely don't have the time to get back to those chapters I referenced earlier within 1 Chronicles 13. So I'm stopping this right now. This is part 1 for your Wednesday, June 8th, 2022. It's the corner with E Dove. Be right back.